Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of The Person You Want to Be. I am your host, Eric Teplitz. Today, I am honored to have with me as my guest, Kent Weishaus. Kent Weishaus is a licensed clinical social worker and psychotherapist in private practice in California. He has worked in psychiatric hospitals, community clinics, and schools, and served as an adjunct professor at Cal State Los Angeles, teaching social work theory and practice classes to graduate students. Prior to Kent's switch to a helping profession, he had a 25-year career in television production, directing and working with many celebrities and actors, writing and producing promotions and teases, interfacing with numerous network executives and finance and legal personnel, and supervising hundreds of crew members. Kent has recently authored a book called Stop Breaking Down: The Secret to Avoiding Overwhelm and Crack-Up, which shows us how to step back, take the high ground, and to observe and understand how the constant barrage of 21st century media and narratives interact with our biological and mental processes. Kent Weishaus, welcome to The Person You Want to Be.
Thank you, Eric. I'm very grateful to appear on The Person You Want to Be and have the chance to have a discussion with you about the various sort of theories I've developed and my approach to therapy and to life in general.
To life in general sounds great. The way I like to typically start these interviews is to have you think back on your earliest childhood memories. And what I'm looking for specifically here is the earliest sense you had, however fanciful it might have been, the earliest idea or ideas you had about what it was you wanted to do, who it was you wanted to be, what you were here for, what you were naturally drawn to, anything along those lines. And if you could also give us a little bit of context as well about the environment in which you grew up.
Sure. This is a bit cliche, but my father was a psychiatrist, and my mother, she had a long career in working for an appliance company, Waste King Universal. And then she, in her mid-50s, said, "You know what? This ain't working for me. I'm going back to get my master's degree and PhD and become a marriage and family therapist." So I sort of followed the same path she did. Although I don't think she approved of me doing it. But so to answer your question, though, these were my parents. These were my parents. My brother, who's older than me, wanted to be an actor, and I sort of idolized him when I was very young. And he went off to Carnegie Mellon University, and I thought, man, if he's going to be an actor, I want to be an actor. And so I started. He also played guitar. I played guitar. I sang. I actually was I think at 8 years old, I was in a production of St. George and the Dragon. It's the very first Renaissance fair in Los Angeles, because Ron and Phyllis Patterson were in my life at that time. So, yeah, I wanted to be an actor. I wanted to get into theater, probably early on because of emulating my brother. Then it became evident to me in high school. I took a class called The Psychological Interpretation of History from a wonderful teacher, and now he's been for many years a therapist, Ken Waldman. And that really opened my eyes to the things behind our behavior and different ways of approaching life and explaining things. And so I actually was an undeclared major in college for a year. And then I transferred colleges, went up to Sonoma State, where I got into the psychology department. I thought, oh, okay. And it's so funny. It was like 1972 or three. I got to Sonoma, and as I was checking in to get into the classes, they said, "Okay, for the first 2 years, it's all behavioralism, nothing but behavioralist psychology. You'll be reading Skinner and his offspring." I'm going, but what about humanistic? I've just come out of a place where I've been reading Jung and Lang and Freud. Nope, none of that. It's all behavioralism. I said, well, I was an undeclared before this. I think I'll become an undeclared major now and see how I feel about this. And so I even though I got accepted in the psych department, I gravitated pretty quickly over to theater, started directing, acting, and then once I got my bachelor's degree a few years later, within a couple of years, I was working in television production because as a theater person, that's where you can make a living.
Okay. Thank you for that. That was full of things for me to follow up with. And I think the first follow-up question for you is, why do you think your mother did not approve of your doing a similar thing as she did in her 50s with a pretty big 180 career switch?
Well, I was pretty successful in television. I had an ongoing career. I was, I think, when I told her I was interested in going back to school and becoming a therapist, I was working on the Arsenio Hall show, which was one of the best times of my TV career. I've worked on probably 100 different shows, but that one really stands out as an exceptional experience. And yet I was getting an idea that maybe there's better ways to try and interact with people, like helping them rather than entertaining them. Or at least what became evident is we're entertaining to sell the sponsor's products. And so that was just germinating in my head at that point. I was just starting, and over the next decade or so, it became crystal clear, I need to get out of this. But so she was saying, you have this career, you shouldn't leave it. And look, she grew up in the Depression. So I have since she passed away right before the pandemic, but I've since come to understand that this was, and also during the war, World War II, she and my father were separated for many, many months without any way of communicating with each other. It was traumatic for them. And so she had certain structured views of things. And I think one of the things distressed her was there's not enough money in therapy, she said. And which I would disagree with, because, you can work in community clinics, or you can hang out a sign in Beverly Hills and take all cash clients. I mean, it just depends on what population you want to work with. So to say that there's not enough money in it, to me, was her experience, but not necessarily everybody's.
Right. So sounds like that she was driven by a desire for security for you and stability, career stability, financially and otherwise. Even so much so that following in her footsteps did not please her idea of what would be best for you. Again, coming from the background she did, growing up in the Depression and having the worldview that she did. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Now, did you grow up in Southern California?
I did. Yeah.
Okay.
Up until the time, like I said, I went to Sonoma State for undergraduate. That was the first time I spent a significant time away from Southern California.
Right. And did you say you started college down here in Southern
I
California?
did.
I'm in Southern California.
Right. No, I went to UC Riverside for a year.
Gotcha. And it sounds like your interest in theater was really propelled and driven by your brother's interest in acting. So your brother's name is Mark, I believe,
That's right.
right? Yeah, and he did pursue a career in acting and had a career in acting, correct?
That's correct.
And when you were a theater major at Sonoma State, did you find yourself more interested, say, like in the directing end of things versus being on stage as an actor? Did that experience as a theater arts major give you any clues as to what your preferences might have been, if things were up to you to decide in terms of career or lifestyle?
Right. Well, I really enjoy performing. And I actually kept performing throughout my career in TV. I had kind of a little side career in a comedy troupe, a comedy magic troupe. So I kept performing, but early on at Sonoma State, I think within the first year I was there, I came to understand I really liked directing. I took a directing class, and then there was a little bit of a void perhaps at the time. There just weren't a lot of people who wanted to direct back then, and so I stepped in and said, "Well, I can do this," and did a fairly successful production of Kurt Vonnegut's "Happy Birthday, Wanda June," and then I did "Streetcar Named Desire." I did the morality play Everyman, and in a different location, I did the Prime of Miss Jean Brodie, Midsummer Night's Dream. That one I actually co-directed with my brother. So yeah, I got into directing.
Yeah, and was that all in college, or did you do some of that after college as well?
That was during college years, although a couple of those productions were done at a summer camp that I was working at in the summers in Southern California, in Idlewild, California.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting that you had this flirtation with psychology as a young person, clearly an interest in it. And from reading your book, the one thing that stood out to me, maybe more than anything else, was how humanistic the worldview in it is, which I very much appreciated. And so I could understand why your young self rejected psychology as a major, given the curriculum that was in front of you versus what your interests were. But
and I will say, in retrospect, taking some behaviorist classes would have been valuable. I'm sorry that they were so rigid as to not allow the other, because I think a mixture would have been quite valuable.
Right. But it is interesting to me, and I've mentioned it in at least one previous episode that I'm thinking of, my conversation with Linda Monk, which was episode 3, for those of you who want to go back and check it out, that there seems to me to be a relationship between, it's not a universal truth by any stretch, but I've noticed a relationship between people in the creative and performing arts and people in the helping professions. There seems to be some overlap in interest and sensibility among those fields. And, to kind of riff off of what you were saying earlier, I think I do view entertainment as a form of helping people and uplifting people. But again, you were noticing a different trend in your work in TV, and maybe different, with a different kind of intention behind it. But I do think that spirit lifting and is encompassed within, I think, helping people.
I agree with you, definitely. Part of it, I just turned 70, so I'm in what Eric Erickson would call the life review stage of development. Part of it is choices I made during my television career that I won't. They weren't black and white choices. There were, as I talk about in the book, there were a number of systems coming to bear on me, and I reacted to those systems and made choices which sent me twice, I think, in the wrong direction. However, that's easy to say now, to create a narrative saying, "Oh, if only I'd made this choice, I would have done more sophisticated programming."
Is that a story you're telling yourself, Kent?
It is.
To quote your book?
Yes. No. And it's something as I have feelings of regret about those choices, I try to slow my thinking down and go, yeah, okay, but you could have equally gone down some other dark rabbit hole had you made that choice, you know? And and so uh, when we review these things and try and make sense out of our lives, it's fraught with the narrative process. And it's really important to remind yourself, as Brene Brown would say, is this a story I'm telling myself? And then by extension, no one could know how else it might have turned out had you
Mm.
made that choice. So
Yeah, now this is really a rich topic because I know that people can torture themselves with regrets about and what ifs. And there's like the potential to torture yourself over such ruminations is seems to be limitless. And
that's for sure.
yeah, and but it also doesn't have to be. And that's one of the things that you point out in your book, which we will
Right.
get to, but I want to cover some other territory first.
Sure.
Um, so you're fresh out of college. How how exactly did you, as a theater major, then? I'm guessing you returned to Southern California after school. And how did you go about finding your way, let's say, even before you entered the world of television production, the entertainment industry? Was there any, what was the process like of navigating life from college graduation up until that point?
I started looking for jobs in theater. And I had a good friend who's actually become, I think, one of the more prolific art directors in television, a guy by the name of Bruce Ryan. He and I early on sort of helped each other with our careers. And I was working in different theater jobs, and that he helped me get into, or maybe I helped him here and there. And then, like I was stage managing something in a small theater, and then I'm trying to think of the other ones, various different productions I did, and then he started getting into television production. And at one point, he was an assistant art director, and he said, "Hey, they need a runner on this sitcom pilot they're doing called Frankie and Annette the second time around, Dick Clark Productions. And you want to come do it for a couple of weeks?" It was Thanksgiving. I was working, actually, at that point, I was working in technical theater director for a private high school, Harvard. Westlake used to be just Harvard. And I said, "Yeah, okay, I got 2 weeks off. I'll go work on this thing for you for Thanksgiving." And they offered me a full-time job. And so I slipped out of the Harvard job and started working full-time for Dick Clark in January of 1979. And that began a career in television production. I started as a runner. I became office manager.
Can you explain what a runner is?
Sure. It's there is some dovetail with my book here. It's a guy who shows up. There are plenty of people around who say they want to work on something, but don't show up, don't, or ultimately are not trustworthy to get the job done. If you want to be successful, the way to be trustworthy is to show up at least 4 out of 5 times, if and preferably 95% of the time. So I showed up. I ran all over Los Angeles doing errands for Dick and producers, and pretty quickly they saw that I was reliable. I think within a few weeks or maybe a month or two, and they said, "Hey, why don't you become the assistant on American Bandstand?
Huh.
There's a guy there who he wants to move on. We'll groom you to be the production coordinators, and you'll be the guy who's in charge of getting all the dancers to come on, because it was shot every 6 weeks." And so, no internet back then. You sent out letters to 300 or 200 couples, and whoever responded, and hopefully they showed up, and you had a big group of people dancing together on Bandstand. So I was the guy who got those people, along with the guy who put fruit baskets in the stars' dressing rooms, and man, I thought I'd arrived. I thought you walk onto stage 59 at ABC, KABC Prospect, in those days, and it was like it's a historical. It's a studio that goes back to the silent era in East Hollywood, and you walk onto the stage and it's air conditioned and hushed, and the set's been set up and the lights are being tweaked, and it's like, oh man, I have arrived. This is the real theater.
That's funny.
and so I did bandstand for a couple of years that way, and I. It's interesting. I had a conversation. I got to know Dick fairly well. Okay, as did everyone who was working there. Very nice guy for the most part. However, at one point, I said to him, I do want to further my career in this business. And I would like to become a director. I'd like to become a television director. And he sat across his big desk and said, I don't see you as a director. And that was a big deflection right there. I was like, oh, okay. I said, well, what's plan B? He said, I tell you what, let me have you become an associate producer on some shows and see how you like that. And associate producer at that time, it's like, I think they call it line producer now. Basically, you're doing budgets, you're making sure the call times are right, the elements of the script that have to be shot or set up to be done in a certain way. And so he did that for me. He said, let's have you become associate producer. And it's so funny because I was working with a guy named Gene Weed, who Gene used to be one of the boss jocks on KHJ back in the 60s. So I was sort of idolizing him. And he was a producer for Dick at that time. He's like a one-man band. He could get it all done without me. But he took me under his wing and showed me what had to be done. And I learned a lot from him. And I don't know, within a year after that, I made a decision to move on. And I got work as production coordinator on different other shows till eventually I became regular associate producer, which is what my title was on the Arsenio Hall show, like a decade later. So yeah, that's some of the history.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's very interesting to hear the arc and progression of your TV career. And I'm struck by a couple of things. Firstly, how much of life is about time and place and opportunity. Your whole entrance into the industry came about through your friend's invitation for a 2-week assignment as a runner. You proved yourself as reliable and dependable. And the classic, I think it's attributed to Woody Allen, but the classic line about 99% of life being showing up.
Exactly right. They have a T-shirt that says that. And 99% of success is just showing up.
Yeah. But, you have to have that opportunity first. You have to have, you have to be given an opportunity to show up for something, right? And you have to be, a door has to be opened at some point. I mean, there are stories of people just showing up relentlessly until someone hires them and showing an incredible amount of determination and persistence to be given an opportunity. Right. Yeah. But it's so interesting to me that this opportunity that easily might not have come your way, this invitation from a friend, opened up the door to a 25-year, maybe even plus career in an industry, whereas you could have easily, remained at Harvard Westlake, and who knows where that path may have taken you. And it's not to like say one is better than another. It's just really interesting to reflect on these experiences in our lives that are inflection points and that are so pivotal, and how sometimes something really arbitrary can initiate them.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah. There's if you've ever read, is it Gladwell who wrote the book Outliers?
Malcolm Gladwell.
Yeah. He talks about, some of these people we consider genius icons, and they had a proclivity for what they're good at, but without the events unfolding the way they did around them, they never would have become like Bill Gates, and he talks about the Beatles actually, having this proclivity. They went to Germany, and they amassed 10,000 hours of playing, and so that's like, if they didn't have that opportunity, none of that would have come about. So who knows how it would. And so same thing with me. I, I'm I was probably privileged in that I'm a white guy from a upper middle class family. Um, and I had what they would call a good enough parenting. That my attachment style, if I was to comment on my own attachment style, was good enough to not harbor fears of showing up, or fears of rejection. And so I was able, because of this confluence of systems and events around me, to show up to work and have a positive feeling, even sort of define myself. This is what I do, and I like doing it, and I'm going to keep showing up and keep coming through as much as I can. This is sort of part of my privilege, and I want to recognize it as such, because had I been a person with brown skin, I might not have had these opportunities, or they might have unfolded differently. So there you go.
Yeah. And then another inflection point in what you recapped, a big one from my vantage point, is Dick Clark, that conversation you had with him, and
Yes.
him essentially like um uh opening the gate for you to become an associate producer, but also the power that he wielded over your life in that moment is striking, hearing you tell that story, because you had this ambition and he was going to, like, in a sense, he was such a powerful person in the industry that if he wanted to, perhaps he could have, given you an opportunity to direct something, and where that would have taken you, who knows?
Well, the first
But
step would have been, there's sort of three tiers to directing. There's stage managing, associate directing, at least in video, and directing. In film, it's different. First and second AD, production manager, directing. But so he could have said, okay, why don't you let me have you stage manage something? But that's a huge thing for him, because suddenly I'm in the Directors Guild, and that's a much bigger financial outlay for him than the salary he was paying me. So I see his motivation for saying, I'd rather have you be a producer than a director. I'm sorry he did it, because I saw myself as a director.
yeah, but it's interesting nonetheless, right, that he wielded so much power over your fate in that moment.
Yeah.
For better and or worse, who's to say, right? But we don't get to watch the tape of each parallel path that
No,
Kent may have gone down. But
exactly.
yeah, I just that to me is a pivotal moment, and again, it's still a position of privilege to be in a situation like that.
That's right.
Um, so there's so many ways of looking at this, and so many ways to frame the narrative, as again, to foreshadow a little bit about what your book speaks to.
Sure.
Not just
One other little anecdote I'll just say. There
yeah.
was a guy, I hired him to be a runner once I was I was office manager. I was hiring the runners now. And I hired him, and he's a good looking white guy also, and he's showing up and getting stuff done the way I did, but Dick didn't like him. And it's like, I just don't like him. I just don't feel very good about it. And so I was not able to give him the same kind of chance I had to start off. And I don't know what motivated him, Dick, to say that. I know it was frustrating to me, because this guy seemed to be as good as I was. Let's use him to get stuff done. And I wasn't able to.
Yeah. So the many factors in our lives that shape our trajectories, right? Within and beyond our control.
Right.
So, it's you kind of, you left at Clark Productions, and then you mentioned that You took on other jobs. There was work to be had. You retained your title of associate producer. And then significantly, you mentioned the Arsenio Hall show. I grew up in the 80s. I certainly remember watching the Arsenio Hall show. I guess this was what, maybe late 80s, early 90s.
Yeah, we shot the first one in '88, and then it became a big hit in early '89. So yeah.
Yeah, it was a huge show for sure. And yeah, so and it sounds like that was one of the highlights of your experience in the industry. So I would love to hear if you have any specific anecdotes, let's say from the Arsenio Hall show, that stand out to you. I'd love to hear about one or two of those.
Oh man. Well, I there's a lot of them. I guess here's something that happened. I think in the first year, in '89 I got married, and I was working on the show, and so Arsenio was doing a thing where he was walking around backstage with the camera following him, introducing everybody, and he says, "This is Kent. He just got married, and he only took one day off." He said about me, and all I could do is I sort of froze up. I just went, I shrugged my shoulders and went, and I talked to him about it later. He said, "Why didn't you give me a bigger reaction there?" And I said something like, "Oh, you don't want to upstage the boss." And Arsenio ribbed me saying, "Oh yeah, you wouldn't do it to Alan Thicke, you wouldn't do it to Dick Clark, you don't want to do it to me." So,
That's funny.
and so it's interesting. I recently dug up that piece of tape of him saying this is Kent, and that's why I'm reminded of it.
Yeah, and you had a freeze response, which you write
Yes.
about in your book, right?
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about fight, flight, and freeze, since this gives us an opportunity to do so, and what the ramifications of those responses are or were to our forebears.
Yeah, it's interesting. It was a freeze response. And I since I fancied myself a performer, I'm not sure why that was. Maybe I just was caught between two roles of producer and performer,
Hmm.
and it's like, I didn't think he was gonna come over to me, and it kind of I froze in the spotlight. So yeah, that's a pretty sort of minor occurrence of this mechanism that I talk about in Stop Breaking Down, which is how we are all familiar with fight or flight. And increasingly, there's more of a dialogue about freeze, but freeze, a mammalian response in the face of danger. And whether it's just sniffing danger in the air all the way down the continuum to death is inevitable. There's some kind of a freeze response, whether it's just stop and freeze or a total collapse, which is in some circles theorized to be like an analgesic response to being killed.
Interesting.
So so yeah, um, and so in my work now as a therapist, the freeze response, I see it a lot because it's what happens when people have anxiety attacks. It's one part of the continuum where they're shaking, rapid thoughts, sweating, and a feeling of being out of control, feeling of not being able to move, a feeling of not being able to breathe, um, is someplace on the continuum of severe danger is about to strike. This is what we see in mammals as they're threatened, and with humans we have the interesting proclivity. Our abstract thinking brains, our self-aware ability for abstract thought brains take thoughts and ruminate and circulate them over and over and over, such that something feels like it's absolutely true, but in fact, it's just a thought. or a memory shutting us down, sending us into the freeze mode. Peter Levine, who has an intervention that he's created for many years called somatic experiencing, he sees the importance of kind of a mammalian release of visceral trapped trauma energy, to help people get better and resume functioning. That and he observes that in mammals, if a rabbit survives, gets out of the clutches of a fox and runs away and lives successfully, against all odds, it will tend to sort of shake it off. It's like you see it in dogs and cats where they just go, and I theorize that they don't have the abstract thinking capabilities that we do and the language-based thinking capabilities that we do, so they cannot ruminate about what I call I, me, mine consciousness. This is it's mine. It happened to me. It's threatening me. It's going to threaten me again. It always was going to threaten me. Lower mammals are not plagued with that kind of rumination the way we are. So they're able to shake it off. And again, I theorize they're left with an imprint. Danger at that watering hole, avoid it. But not having to relive it over and over and over. And so, Levine's intervention works to allow a mammalian release, a visceral mammalian shaking off release of prior trauma. Doesn't mean that our consciousness isn't going to return to it at some point, and maybe you want to revisit the release. But yeah, I think it's quite valuable.
Yeah, part one of your book is titled "Apes with Car Keys."
Yeah,
and the underlying point really is that evolutionarily speaking, we're much the same biologically as humans were 100,000 years ago, but we're in drastically different contexts, like being put on the spot by Arsenio Hall on television, during a recorded show as an example. And so we have these responses that date back, tens, if not hundreds of thousands of years to survival impulses. And but again, the contexts are remarkably different. And we're going to get into that a little bit deeper in just a bit with
okay.
When we tackle your book. But first, I want to ask you, 1989, you got married. So when and how did you meet your wife?
Well, that was actually at the summer camp that I mentioned earlier up in Idlewild. We had both worked for at separate times for a guy who's become one of our best friends. His name is Bill Lohman. And he introduced us. He and his wife introduced us, and Amy is my wife's name. She moved in with me within the first 6 or 9 months, and then we got married in 1989. So
Nice.
That's how I met her.
Okay. And so you had mentioned a little bit earlier in our conversation that this feeling in you had been gestating for, it sounded like, a good decade of something not feeling quite right. And you said that the germ of that was felt while you were working on Arsenio Hall.
Yeah.
And seemingly having a good experience.
Yeah, it was a good experience by and large. However, trying to think of a couple of books I read during that time. I think it was Neil Postman wrote "Amusing Ourselves to Death," and there was another one that started to worm their way into my consciousness. That there is positive value in entertainment, certainly, and there's a continuum and it's incredibly subjective. But what's positive and valuable to what is instilling false expectations, false senses of danger and threat, and also what is simply saying, this is a problem over here. Look over here. Here's a problem. And we're going to focus on this and show you footage about it. And we're going to repeat the footage over and over and over. And now you know this is a problem, whereas the real problem is actually over here, and we're not talking about it. It's like a magic trick. And so I say this because I gravitated towards, not entirely, but I did these tabloid shows. And I like to think I actually got pretty good at creating promos, edits, writing stuff that would repeat footage and get people's eyeballs to look at it, to get them to watch stuff. And ultimately, in the tabloid world, I don't think it's healthy by and large. So, look, I have another friend who wound up producing some really fine motion pictures. And I guess I would just say I regret not going down that road. But at the same time, you know what? I never would have wound up where I'm at now with this greater understanding of life. So I'm happy he did it and had that experience. I wish I had avoided tabloid-like television, but that's all right.
Yeah. So, at what point would you say things came to a head for you? So this sort of uneasy feeling about the work you were doing and the value of it, socially speaking, was brewing, and in your book, you only really mention yourself personally in passing, only really a handful of times at best. And I'm going to quote from one of those. But before I do, I'm just interested in hearing from you as to, do you recall anything being a breaking point for you, or a moment where enough was enough and you were ready to do something about those feelings of wanting to do something differently?
Not one specific moment. There are a number of them. Uh, and there was some dissonance, you know. Like I said, I worked on tabloid shows where I had to show up at work at 4:30 or 5 in the morning to get a show on the air by 1:30 or 2 in the afternoon. And you're driven by caffeine, and you're having, by and large, a kind of a good time slapping these stories together and getting them up on the air. Um, and the adrenaline rush feels good. To identify with that program feels good. But if you slow down your thinking and you say, wait, what is the end result of the product I'm producing? It's false expectations about celebrities and events. You know, tabloid television came about in the mid to late 90s, and now it's been adopted by news stations worldwide. It's like you don't get the news anymore, you get tabloid. And it's like, so in retrospect, I really regret that part of it. And so
Focusing on the most sensational, most titillating to the nervous system aspects of stories, without regard to much else, right? Like
that's
just
right.
get eyeballs on the screen, clicking on ads, buying things.
That's right. That's right. And you weren't clicking on ads back
Yeah.
then, but you were just watching the ads.
Yeah.
A story I've told here and there is one day I rolled in the wrong, we had 10-second fee spots, which are like commercials. I rolled in the wrong one, and I was called upstairs to the boss's office. And he said, the gruff guy said, "Don't you get it? This show is wraparound for commercials." And that was a light bulb going on. It's like it was a big reminder. Oh yeah, that's what I'm doing here, creating products to have you watch the commercials, creating the programming to have you watch the commercials. And that was one moment, but there were a couple of dozen others. I had some. I don't want to go into detail about this, but I was on the first 6 months of the Dr. Phil show and had some eye-opening experiences there. Um, and then you and I talked before the podcast about this company I had worked for producing some fairly
Rehearsals.com.
right, producing some pretty sophisticated pieces on artists in rehearsal. But yeah, I can't talk too much about this one, except to say that from a managerial standpoint, it was doomed to failure. And so, whereas I had a great time doing the programming, um, it was not to hit the light of day. So, and that programming was really interesting. You got to see, sophisticated artists at work producing their product, and there's value in, I think, just as you and I were talking, there's value in some programming that allows you to see how art is created or takes you back to a historic part in history that and tells you a story, whether or not it's historically accurate. It gets you thinking about it. And then there's also just value in terms of television, media. I'm reluctant to say social media, but television and film media as a way of coping, right? We'll watch a program that we like and we get out of our own skin. Okay. Now, coping mechanisms run a wide gamut from healthy ones like, jogging or karate or meditation or being a painter, down to unhealthy ones, drinking, drugs, illegal drag racing, illegal base jumping, that kind of thing. These things that get us out of our own skin. Although I unfairly I said meditation. Actually, meditation, if it's done right, gets you into your own skin. So,
And also like all things in moderation, right? So in other words, enjoying a TV show in and of itself could actually be a healthy way of coping with a stressful day, but there's a line, and it's not clear where that line is, and it's maybe different for different people. But like there's use and abuse, and there's like benefiting from something and becoming dependent on it
yes,
to cope. So
absolutely right,
yeah,
right.
so it's pretty. The point being is that there's a lot of gray area and nuance to this.
Yeah,
It's
and
not.
as you say that, maybe there are times that tabloid television is okay.
Mhm.
But
Let's get you back into that career.
that's right. That's right. But by and large, I would say it it's one thing to lose your own, get out of your own skin by watching a sitcom or a film or a historical fiction or a documentary, even a balanced documentary. But it's another thing to have flutter cuts and fast images being repeated over and over and over to you. I just my sense is there's better ways to
Sure.
cope with life.
Yeah. Um, yeah. So it sounds like there wasn't a single incident, but you did give us a sample of experiences that you had that made you feel that clarified things for you a little bit about what it was you actually were doing and how and is this the way you wanted to spend your time and
Right.
your life energy. I'm just curious as to, you mentioned that when you first met, talked to your mom about this idea of switching careers and you got the response from her that you did your dad, being a psychiatrist, have any opinion one way or another on your professional life and a decision to switch gears as you did?
I don't recall him saying anything one way or another. He died in 1998. And so it was probably not too many years before that I was starting to think seriously about making the switch, and I
I see. He
don't.
didn't live to see you actually make the
No,
switch.
no, he
Yeah.
did not. No, no. When he died, I was working on these tabloid shows. So,
Mm, yeah.
um,
Okay. If I may quote from your book, you write, in 2005, I began a transition away from a career in the television business that had been focused on programming that attracted eyeballs to it at any cost. I knew there was something else to be pursued in life, but I couldn't put my finger on it. My therapist suggested I read Robert Caron's book, Becoming Attached. In reading about the origins of attachment theory and the work of John Bowlby in the 1940s, my eyes were opened to attachment as an evolutionary mechanism within the context of human consciousness. So, my question then is, how did you go from reading Becoming Attached and developing this curiosity and fascination with attachment theory? How did that parlay into an actual decision about a career change, and specifically, why social work?
right. Well, attachment theory to me pointed towards answers to questions as to why people behave the way they do. Um, Not ironclad conclusively, but here was a framework around why different people, might be hostile, might be friendly, might overwork, might be seen as not working enough, and uh, it I don't want to sling too much mud here, but television production, um, I think there's a fair amount of insecure attachment in the
Interesting.
personnel there, at least that I was interacting with, um, and
Can you explain what you mean by insecure attachment?
yeah,
And then maybe just a more broadly like framed explanation of attachment theory. I know it can get complicated, but just sort of just for those who may not have heard about it before.
right. I I experienced people being invalidating. Okay, so look, we can disagree, we can be unhappy with somebody else's performance, but it's not a good idea to demean or abuse them psychologically. If you want to be straight with somebody, if you want to tell them that you're distressed with them, that's one thing, but it's another thing to be abusive. And there's plenty of abuse around television circles. And so I that helped me kind of understand the business I was in. Why are
Mm.
people behaving this way? And
And
then,
attachment theory being again like uh hearkening back to childhood and the young child's attachments or the nature of their relationships with their parents or caretakers, right? Can you just elaborate a little bit on that and then explain like secure attachment versus insecure attachment, which is what you described you saw a lot of in the TV business?
right. So a secure attachment is what I hope we all strive for. Okay. Nurturing, validating caregivers or parents at a young age. Though we may strive for it, we frequently don't achieve it. In fact, statistically, they say less than half the population has a secure attachment, and that gap is growing. Um, so when a secure attachment is a predictor for greater self-regulation later in life, and a greater ability to introspect later in life. Now, we live in a system that negates secure attachment in many ways because parents are busy. They have to sort of assign caregiving duties to daycare or schools. Kids are latchkey kids. They are benignly neglected, but it adds up. That there's not somebody there to give them structure, nurturing structure, and so we live in a system that fosters this, that doesn't want to pay much for daycare, that doesn't want to give people family leave, to help children come into the world, and so this is a formula. This is a recipe for dysregulation later in life. Now, it's a predictor, but it's not saying it causes it. A does not cause B. It's a statistical likelihood. There are always going to be outliers that escape the what seems to be an ironclad story. And if you look at individual stories, you see that although their parents may have been dismissive and abusive, there's an aunt or there's an uncle or there's a good friend who stepped in, and maybe they weren't there much of the time, but they were there some of the time. So at least they got some secure anchor.
Would that be an example of what you called good enough at the beginning of this show? Good enough parenting or attachment, right?
Well, it could be, but no, good enough is, parents are stressed. They slip and they invalidate 1 out of 5 times, but the other 4 out of 5 times they're there and predictable and loving. That's seen as good enough. Okay, not greatly secure, but secure enough, right, to predict later on self-regulation and ability to introspect. So the TV business, at least in my experience, there were plenty of instances of people who were demeaning and abusive. In fact, I don't want to go into great details, but I had one experience which was a life-changing thing where I was severely psychologically abused, and it caused me to change direction, and leave what may have been a career in sitcom production and direction and go more towards talk shows and tabloids. And so you see people behaving this way. They're not self-regulated, and they're happy to dump it on you. So that was part of the reason I say, well, this is TV, and I'd heard that to some degree, depending on movies that are produced, you may see some of that there. I remember, I'm just remembering a specialized shot with one director. So the runner didn't show up on time with something, and he was caught in traffic. And I remember the director becoming furious and saying, I'm paraphrasing here, but he said something like, "I want that guy brought out here and publicly humiliated." And it's like, oh yeah, that's going to help. That's going to help everything, So one of the broad strokes I try and convey in this book is, okay, so even though you're imprinted with an insecure attachment, insecure, anxious, ambivalent, these are different grades of insecure attachments that can be, and the current research is epigenetic research, that environments have certain genes that flip on or off that then reflect behaviors. Okay, and epigenetics is backing up the science of attachment more and more with each study that's done. And so, but that being said, if you come to understand, and I would recommend that everyone read Robert Karen's book, Becoming Attached, so they get an understanding of it. If you come to an understanding of it, you can make a choice. No, wait, I want to move towards more secure attachments in my life. You can unlearn insecure attachments and begin to gravitate towards more validating and nurturing relationships, not just with your significant other, but with friends, with colleagues, business associates, family, and some of it involves setting boundaries. You may have family members, these days you've got diametrically opposed political beliefs that trigger huge arguments. It may involve setting boundaries, but screaming invalidating things, or hurtling darts that are invalidating at people generally is not going to accomplish anything good. People want to feel heard. They want to feel validated. So John Gottman is a marriage and family therapist researcher who's done decades of work, and we all disagree about things. We disagree with our spouses about things on a day-to-day basis, but how we handle those disagreements is what's crucial. Gottman says, if you can be, rather than being dismissive, if you can be curious about disagreements rather than dismissive and invalidating, you are predicted to have a much more successful marriage, or any other relationship, colleague, family, what have you. So because we want to feel heard, we want to feel validated, we don't want to feel invisible, kicked to the curb, unimportant. Those are things we don't want. So if we don't want that, let's start behaving in a validating way to each other, even if we disagree.
Yeah, a couple of short quotes from your book on this point of all hope is not lost if you did not have a secure attachment in childhood.
That's right.
You write here, safe emotional sharing of vulnerable feelings is the single greatest predictor of a successful recovery from trauma. And then another quote along those lines, identifying a trustworthy person with whom one can safely share vulnerability is an important mitigating factor in coping with the modern world.
Right.
And that speaks more broadly, secure attachment, insecure attachment, regardless of what your early experiences were like. That connection with someone trustworthy with whom you feel safe to be yourself and can speak to about your vulnerabilities and feel attended to and cared about is pivotal. I think it's just pivotal to well-being. And so this is a really, I think, important point. And I had a guest on my show, a philosophy professor and boxing coach by the name of Gordon Marino, who's a wonderful writer as well. And he had a very troubled youth and was on a really self-destructive path. And he attributes this ability, he called it an ability that he had to, when he saw a good-hearted and intelligent person reaching out, he had the grace or the sense or the whatever you want to call it to take their hand and have them help him. And
right.
this was transformative to him, not only in his own development and in his own like evolution as a person, but he then returned the favor to his students and the people that he helped coach with boxing and football for that matter, to be that person, to be that trustworthy person for those young people and to help sort of like pay it forward and pay back what was given to him. It's really, really touching. So yeah, I think this is a really a key thing to emotional well-being for all of us.
Yes. Yeah, there's a guy on the East Coast who does a lot, has a trauma clinic, Bessel van der Kolk, and that one of those quotes was sort of a paraphrasing of one of the greatest predictors for an okay outcome to a trauma, to an identifiable severe trauma, is trustworthy social support. So whether that's one person or a small group of people that are able to stand next to you and say, this I get, you feel really bad, this feels very bad, and I may not understand it, but I'm standing with you here. That's validation, that's trustworthiness, that's showing up for the person, and that's a predictor generally a statistical predictor for a better outcome with traumas, whether they be child abuse, wartime traumas, automobile accidents, you name it.
Right. So you read Becoming Attached at the recommendation of your therapist, and take me from that experience to making the decision to pivot into a whole new career. You were in your 50s at this point.
That's right.
Pretty big thing to do. You explained the toxicity of the environment of the TV business that you were in, so one can understand and sympathize with the desire to get out. But I know that I'm sure plenty of people feel whatever career they happen to be in, they feel trapped by their dependence on the paycheck and by the uncertainty, especially nowadays, of the work world and availability of jobs and entire like categories of jobs being threatened of becoming obsolete, and on and on and on. So I'm just interested to sort of, if I could get into your psyche a little bit about where you were at in your 50s, preparing to make this big decision, how you arrived at the decision, and why you chose, again, social work specifically, because there are any number of other quote unquote helping professions you could have in theory chosen. So what was it? What was the draw of social work? Was it the fact that that was the path your mom had pursued? Was there any connection to that? Or yeah.
No. So I'm not sure which question to answer first.
Yeah, I know. I flooded you there.
The social work path. I looked around. Well, first of all, let me back up. So my wife is a professional singer, and she has sung as a classical chorus singer professionally. Not an easy job in itself, but she has been trained and has had a good enough voice that she sang with probably the best choir in the world, the Los Angeles Master Chorale, for many years, and she started getting hired on movies to sing choral backups to movies, and she's now done over 100 films
Oh,
that way.
wow.
And so back in back at the early 2000s, her career was just taking off, and so when we were first married, I was the breadwinner, and she was singing to some degree, fairly low paid or unpaid. And I said, well, keep pursuing it. She was teaching, but not making a great income. Then right around the time, I said, this is it. We had sold a house and made some money on it. So and we moved to a rental and said, okay, this is it. I'm gonna tighten my belt, go back to school. And right around that time, her career started to take off as a singer in films and also on recordings and things like that. And so again, I'm privileged to have married her. I'm privileged to have had the career I had, where I was able to put aside enough money to be able to say, I'm going to do this. And yeah, it's going to be some belt tightening, but I'm going to do it. And then, almost sort of unexpectedly, her career takes off, and we got some big residual checks that first summer, which caused us to breathe a sigh of relief. And then, okay, that's part one. That's what things sort of looked like at the time. Social work. I had been looking into psychology, marriage and family therapy. Counseling was not so much a big thing back then. It is now, and I didn't just get a degree in counseling. That was just beginning back then. So I took a fairly good look at those lines of study, and social work, because of its emphasis on systems theory, person in environment, appealed greatly to me. And you can see it resonates throughout my book that we have not only the environment around us that consists of hundreds of different systems, and major ones that are identifiable, or half a dozen. But then there's also systems within us that are at play, and I make a fairly important turn here when this is internal family systems. Richard Schwartz's intervention for therapeutic intervention talks about subpersonalities within us, which I see as systems within us. They're extensions of different parts of our metabolism or our brains that are sending us messages and even take on their own subpersonalities. And so how are the systems outside of me and within me affecting me? I may have very rigid systems within me because of an insecure attachment I had as a young person. So I've got a voice perhaps that says, don't trust them, don't trust anybody. And that's a system, okay? Pay attention to it. How's it affecting me? The other point in the book, big broad stroke point, is slow down your thinking to look at the systems at play within you and outside of you. Slow it down, and because we're all prone to knee-jerk reactions. That's the mammalian way of staying alive. Quickly identify danger and either take a aversive action or be aggressive. Quickly identify opportunities and jump on them, right? But in our multicultural, highly developed world, these mammalian systems of staying alive don't really work very well for us. And we have the blessing and curse of abstract thinking, self-aware abstract thinking. So now I'm losing my train of thought here. Where am I going with this?
Well, the social work, like why social work,
Right.
and it was the appeal of systems thinking along with the personality and the development of the person, right?
Thank you, Eric. That, and actually, you see going way down the line how systems thinking and systems theory winds up in the peculiar area I've wound up here, and what I'm saying in my book.
Yeah. And so when you decided to go back to school, to grad school, you went to Cal State LA, is that right, for
That's
grad
right.
school?
That's right.
And for an MSW, Master's of Social Work.
Right.
Did you have in mind, even before you started, what you wanted to do in the field of social work? Because there's a lot of different ways in which a social work can show up in the world professionally. Like, did you have a sense of the kind of work you wanted to do, or were you just drawn in that direction and were kind of taking it as it came in terms of your education?
I had a story I was telling myself that I wanted to be a therapist.
Okay.
My father was a psychiatrist back in the day. The psychiatrists were actually psychotherapists. He was an analyst. Another psychiatrist friend of mine describes that as being a therapist with a prescription pad. That's what my father was. My mother was a therapist, and so I thought, well, I think I can do this. And that was the story I was telling myself. I knew very little about it. When I got into social work, my eyes were open in a number of different areas, and not the least of which being I interned early on at a psychiatric hospital, partly because my father had been he was head of outpatient clinic at a hospital later in his career. I thought, okay, I wonder what this will be like, and that was an eye opener. I mean, people who were on 72-hour holds because their functioning had stopped, basically, because of severe clusters of symptoms that rendered them unfunctional, whether they were depressive, anxiety, psychotic symptoms. And so and then I found when I started that internship, I really enjoyed that work. I thought, well, maybe I don't want to be a therapist after all. Maybe I can just be a guy who goes to work in a hospital and helps people regain their functioning.
Well, that would still be a therapist, but not a one-on-one like private practice therapist. Yeah.
Not in the sort of traditional Hollywood view of psychotherapy, right? So I did that, and really, I probably would have continued doing that. I worked at a second psych hospital, which wasn't nearly as good as the first one. And anyway, um, basically, I wanted to be my own boss. I didn't want to have to say, okay, you're on this 12-hour shift Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday next week, and you have to show up then. Um, I thought, well, if I want to escape other people's structure, I'm gonna have to hang up my own shingle and be my own boss. So I did that, and so I wound up as a psychotherapist, but it's much different than I imagined it to be uh, before I got into the business.
How so?
Um, the I was really ignorant of serious traumas prior to going to grad school. And it's interesting because the people I was in grad school with, many of them had experienced serious traumas. Um, I can point out a few things that happened to me in my youth, but these many people had experienced chronic abuse or events that influenced them, and they wanted to become helping profession people as a result. My influences were, okay, well, my parents did it, maybe I have a proclivity for it. I had no idea of really what I was getting into, and now that I'm doing it, I enjoy it quite a bit, but it's got a set of challenges different than I ever imagined. Um, and I should just say an aside here. I'm semi-retired now. I only work 2 days a week. So, but I've got colleagues who are working 5 days a week, 40 hours or more a week, and it's challenging. It is challenging to set your own schedule and do that for them.
Right. I'm interested in hearing about what your experience was as a returning student in your 50s. Can you speak
Sure.
to that? Yeah.
Well, that was actually a really good part of it. I wasn't sure what the heck was going to happen. I thought, well, um, I'm going to do this. It's funny. I was working for E-Entertainment the last couple of years on these specials that would come up, and I'd work for a couple of months and then be off for a month and work for a couple of months. So when I was accepted to Cal State LA, they said, okay, there's 2 undergrad courses you have to take to be able to get into the master's program. Assuming you pass these courses, we're going to accept you next fall. And so one of them was biology of aging, and the other was God, I can't remember the other one, but they were both very stimulating. That's even though I can't remember the second one. No, one was a psychology course. That's right. Social psychology. That's right. Social psychology and biology of aging. Incredibly stimulating. So I'm going to these courses at night while I'm working at E-Entertainment during the day, supervising edits of these, put your eyeballs on this type thing. So I thought, okay, if this is what the work is like, I'm going to love it. And the next fall, I jumped in. And Eric, for me, I don't know if others would have this experience, but for me, it was like everything I hoped for. I couldn't soak enough of this information in. And I got straight A's, and I loved it. I loved going back to school. Again, I was privileged in that I didn't have to work. Also, my wife was working. Although I argued that I guess I was working as an intern a number of hours a week as part of the schooling. Yeah, so I loved it. And upon graduation, I was offered or I applied for the job in the psych hospital I'd been working at as an intern. And as soon as I got my associate's license, I was hired there and went right to work. It's I've never I have no regrets going into this career. Social work allows a wide spectrum of things to be done, systems theory and applications means you can work in a macro sense. You can work with communities. You can work with politicians or in politics. Um,
Hmm.
uh, and a micro sense, which I'm doing one to one or working with families. You can work in something in between community clinics, community, whether you're working one to one with people or trying to shape policy. Um, it's an incredibly flexible career. And anyone who's considering wanting to influence people positively, whether it's as individuals, families, communities, or cultures, nations, I would urge you to consider social work.
Wow, that's quite a statement.
Yeah.
Huh. That's awesome to hear. How were you received by your fellow students? Were there any other similarly aged students? Was there a chasm between you and most of your peers in the program, or what was that like?
Yeah, most of them were in their 20s and 30s. I was the old guy, but there were a couple of us. There was, I think there was one or two women who were almost as old as me and also changing careers,
Hmm.
and another guy who I can't remember if he'd had a background of being incarcerated or not, but people brought their own experiences and gifts to the table.
Hmm.
With this kind of education, you have an opportunity to profoundly influence people. I know that in certain areas, social workers are vilified as the people who are the people who quote unquote take people's children away, and when I was teaching master students, I said very often, one of my favorite quotes was very often, you are going to be where the rubber meets the road of bad policy. And
Hmm.
and it's important to either try and influence that policy or shift where you're working. If you and other people might disagree with me, yeah, I know I'm in an agency that's enforcing bad policy, but I'm trying to change it from within a little
Hmm.
bit. So yeah, I know social workers get maligned, but as the profession itself, if you look at the whole profession, it's quite a valuable um, area of study.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. And it's I love hearing your story of personal and career reinvention in that way. And I think that even the specifics of social work aside, it's just very heartening to hear that you can make such a decision even in your 50s and completely um, choose a new path and a much more satisfying one. So that just hearing about that alone, not to mention the specifics of how much good can be accomplished in the field of social work, I think is just music to the ears, as it were, or at least to mine. So shifting to now to your book,
Mhm.
um, one of the things that I thought made your book fascinating is that it takes into account a lot of different disciplines: anthropology, history, evolutionary biology, sociology, obviously psychology. And it presents this multifaceted, big picture view of how we got to where we are in this day and age, stressed out of our minds and susceptible to all kinds of ill health. So it's a fascinating read and it's very well referenced with detailed notes on all of your sources. So what was cool is that I knew a lot of the sources that you quoted from, but there were people I had not heard of, Gaia Vince being one of them.
She's a
And
wonderful writer.
yeah, so I just appreciate that stuff. And I wanted to, for the sake really of listeners mostly, I wanted to quote um, a few short passages that I think together paint a picture of what I felt you were trying to communicate with the book. And you can tell me if I selected wisely here. Here we go. So the first quote is actually uh, you quote Gaia Vince and you say, science journalist Gaia Vince writes, in the course of a day, The average person in a Western city is exposed to as much data as someone in the 15th century would encounter in their entire life. As humans, we expect ourselves and others to simply adapt to today's world. But what if this duality is being stretched to its limits, and many of us are approaching the boundaries of our flexible thinking and cognitive elasticity? Another shorter quote, you write, only 90 years ago, it was unheard of to have large numbers of cars and trucks passing by us at 70 miles per hour. To our recent ancestors, this would be like an ongoing herd of rhinoceroses continually charging by us. Yet we take it for granted that it is important to our functioning to not show any fear in joining this modern stampede. And then this quote, which I felt perhaps encapsulated like the real meat of the book and the theme. You write, our bodies and minds frequently interpret the demands and threats of today's world, both sensory and narrative, as overwhelming. Even if our reasoning brain in our human cerebral cortex informs us that attack, danger, destitution, and or death are not imminent, our deeper mammalian viscera still responds as if danger is here now. So we have these operating systems that date back, as we said, quite a long time, but they're thrown into a world of chaos and confusion, and we have to just, and it's constantly and very, very rapidly changing. And so we have to adapt. And we are incredibly adaptive animals, human beings, for better and or worse. But it's, you know, with those quotes, I think it paints a picture of kind of how we got to where we are. And then in the latter part of the book, you introduce the sort of what we can do about it, techniques and modalities, some of which we've already discussed. But one thing that I thought also was worth quoting is this short passage when you say, psychological diagnostics are almost always created without any thought as to the emotions or the behaviors behind them being a developmentally normal response to the modern world. So we're basically like shamed for being not adapting and not just ignoring our biology and the systems that have, you know, led to us as human animals. Like we're sort of we're looked at as not enough or somehow insufficient if we don't just adapt to the you know, all the noise of the modern world as if it weren't unbelievably chaotic to our systems. And we don't even necessarily realize this, especially because we don't really necessarily understand consciously any different. This is just the world we're born into. So having given listeners and viewers an idea of kind of the theme of your book, and by the way, would you say that accurately kind of represents the crux of your book and its theme?
Yes. Yeah, I'd love to hear my quotes read back to me. Thank you. No, it does. And I've actually taken it a step further, although it would be congruent with what you just said. And hopefully I'll get a chance to tell you about
Sure.
that as well.
Yeah. So, well, what I was going to ask you is, and there are a lot of things that, a lot of directions we can go in here, but I want to look at the problems with the mental health system as it exists now, because you don't shy away from them in the book. And so let's say someone identifies with what we're talking about and they say, yeah, I do feel overwhelmed, and it's nice and validating to hear that I'm not insane for feeling overwhelmed, you know, because there are legitimate reasons to feel overwhelmed, which is what
in fact, the overwhelmed feeling may be the same response.
Exactly. Yes. And certainly it's a common one, increasingly common one, I think. So, so there are some challenges with the mental health field. And, you know, you talked about your dad being a psychiatrist in a different era when psychiatrists also doubled as therapists and were not just simply psychopharmacologists. Um, you write in the book, psychiatrists are prone to seeing mental pathology as a deficiency of the individual. And then you quoted Daniel Siegel, a clinical professor of psychiatry at UCLA, who said, the field of mental health is actually a field of disorders. Everything that I was taught to get my board certification as an adult psychiatrist and a child psychiatrist and an adolescent psychiatrist had zero to do with well-being and everything to do with naming disorders and categorizing people. And at the risk of overquoting you, you also write, when I taught, speaking of yourself, when I taught diagnostic classes at Cal State LA, I frequently discussed that the DSM-5 is a necessary evil in that it is the book by which mental and behavioral health clinicians get paid. So if you could explain what the DSM-5 is to those who may not have heard of it, and how dependent the mental health system as it currently stands, at least here in the US, I don't know about elsewhere, is on that. Introduce to us, I know I ask a lot of questions at once, but if you could just explain what the DSM-5 is first. Let's start there.
Sure. Let's see. Oh, that's the wrong one. I was going to pull out a sample here. Oh, this is the old one. This is the DSM-4.
Okay.
But the DSM-5 is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It is the diagnostic book that, at least in the United States, and I think most Western countries, is what determines the pathology, quote unquote pathology, that can be diagnosed and treated by therapists and psychiatrists. And so one of my other favorite quotes from Daniel Siegel is, the DSM-5 has been mistaken for reality.
Right. Yeah.
that look, we have to look at the systems around it. We are meaning-making creatures, storytelling creatures. When we assign a label to something, it carries with it a whole story, okay? General anxiety disorder, major depressive disorder, schizophrenia, obsessive compulsive disorder. These things carry a story that, at least in lay circles, tend to be less than. Oh, you have this thing, you are less than because you have it. Okay. Now, we're trying to overcome that, but the labels themselves continue to carry the stories because we are storytelling creatures. The idea that somebody can simply be dismissed as, oh yeah, there's a schizophrenic down in room 5. Oh, I'm depressed. I'm psychotic, right? The way we talk about these things is, this person, or I am this thing, this story. Consequently, I'll never not be this story. They'll never not be this story. And it's a vicious circle. Our self-aware consciousness makes sense by telling stories, but these stories become self-reinforcing. And so I spent a fair amount of time talking about, first of all, these are clusters of symptoms, okay? The DSM was put together, it's had the unintended consequence of being mistaken for reality. But these are clusters of symptoms that people experience, usually temporarily, okay? Sometimes you can see it longitudinally over time, but generally you have to look at the systems around them. The back of the DSM-5, to their credit, there are, I don't know, 20 or 30 pages of external factors that the person has experienced, from abuse in childhood, spousal abuse, a victim of terrorism, having been deployed to war, having been to prison. There are several hundred categories here that, to me, would make much more sense. In other words, if you're going to diagnose somebody with a story, why not say what really happened to them? Why not say what happened to them from the outside that caused them epigenetically to their behaviors to be modified so that they're not functioning very well, as opposed to they are, this label, and consequently, the age-old mechanism of shame comes into play. That if you are that label, you're shameful for not being able to function as well as how you should, right? Shame, to get into the history of it, I conjecture shame was the thing that allowed us to become cohesive as cultures of when we were in bands of several dozen. If we came together where there were several hundred, maybe 1,000 people, you could no longer sleep with the guy's wife next door, steal his bread, or kill his mother-in-law, so you could no longer act really in a selfish manner, to say, I'm hungry, I'm stealing his loaf of bread, I'm horny, I'm going to sleep with his wife, I'm angry, I'm going to kill somebody. If you did these things, you were shamed by the larger group. Okay, now that is kind of a useful mechanism when we're coming together, trying to live in great groups greater than a few dozen. But now that we're living in, millions and millions, really an interconnected globe of billions, shaming has sort of gone way out of control to reach areas where it's just not useful. It's not helpful to shame somebody who is not functioning well because of an overwhelm caused by 100 different systems, is counterproductive.
Right. And also, there's a difference between the symptom clusters that the DSM-5 describes and identifies and then creates a label for. That's different from being diagnosed with like a physiological disease.
Absolutely. The ICD is the international medical, physical pathology medical diagnosis book. ICD-11, I think they're on. So, and these things can be seen through a microscope, can be biopsied, can be listened to with a stethoscope. There are concrete physical manifestations that you can much more easily at least attempt a diagnosis with, if it's a physical pathology. Mental pathologies, much more slippery slope. What we have are the behaviors we see. We see someone behaving a certain way. And when we talk to them, they may say, I feel a certain way, but we aren't able to concretely witness, other than the behaviors, witness what they're actually, what's going on in the different parts of their mind that are creating these behaviors. So consequently, you may have one person who presents with certain clusters of symptoms, and their diagnosis may vary. If they're diagnosed by 6 different clinicians, you may get six different diagnoses. Major depression, the depression with psychotic features, major anxiety or general anxiety, ADHD, they can't pay attention. And as opposed to, oh no, this is a form of cancer, I see it through the microscope, I can tell you exactly what's going on there with your cells. It's a much more slippery slope than physical diagnosis, and so and made even more slippery by our proclivity for storytelling.
Yeah. So from your vantage point, are there any positives or benefits to these labels?
As I said, it's a necessary evil. If you are working for Medicare or insurance companies, you must diagnose as per these labels, or you will not be paid. And in fact, certain insurance companies have certain diagnoses they won't pay on. Um, and so,
So then you're in like an ethical bind potentially.
yeah,
Do you make up a diagnosis so that you're able to help a patient or a client? Um, you know, like
right,
it's you used the word slippery. It is kind of interesting. And I'm thinking back to when you talked about John Gottman
yeah,
and his recommendation for having a successful and well-functioning relationship. You said that it pays to bring curiosity to the table, like rather than judgment, bring curiosity. So if someone is exhibiting certain behaviors, then it would seem helpful to be curious about why is this happening? What is the context in which this is occurring? Why is this person behaving this way? Because there might be legitimate reasons for it.
that's right. And
And
your word context is all important.
yeah,
It's contextual with the hundreds of systems around them that have come to influence their internal systems, such that their behavior is seen as not functioning. Um, and one other thing with regards to the Gottman approach, you know, in the DSM kind of puts us in a position where we have to pathologize,
hmm,
and in doing so, unless you're really, really careful, you're going to be seen as less trustworthy much of the time. That, in other words,
by whom?
by, well, by the person that you're trying to have rapport with.
Hmm,
Now, sometimes they may be seeking an answer. So I don't want to say that this is always true. Okay. I really want to know why I've been lethargic, not being able
mhm.
to bed, that overwhelming feelings of sadness. Well, you have major depressive disorder. Oh,
Right.
I feel so much better.
Yeah, some people probably are like find a label validating because it's like, oh, this is something. This is an actual condition like that I can explain myself to, right? Like I
Right.
can use to explain what I'm experiencing. So I could see how that might be helpful to some people to who they might feel like, why am I this way? What's going on? And if someone hands you a label, you go, oh, okay, this is a real thing that exists and it explains what I'm experiencing.
It can be. It can be, but many, many other times it can also be demeaning, shameful, and
Absolutely.
and get in the way of establishing rapport.
Hmm.
In other words, so we talked about attachment systems earlier. You in my approach, I think it's very important that a therapist and a client have a have a positive attachment, have a nurturing attachment. There's a school of thought that suggests we are reparenting people. Um, we're showing people that insecure, demeaning, abusive ways of interacting don't have to be true. You can be validated. Okay. Now, doesn't mean you're validating someone who's a mass murderer, as I said on another podcast. But the idea is be curious, try and understand what the person's experiencing, rather than pigeonholing them into the psychotic in room 6.
Right. And someone could feel condemned by a label, whereas one person might feel reassured by a label. Another person might feel, oh, this is like, oh, I am this, I have this, and I'm a hopeless case because of it. Or also the stigma attached to the label. And as you said, there's a great deal of shame still associated with such things. So it's very complex. So my question for you, I love asking people impossible to answer questions. So I
Yeah.
shouldn't stop now. From Kent, what in your opinion would be like, how could the system be improved for the sake of both practitioners and their clients? Is there a better way than the current model? And what might you suggest in that regard?
Yeah. Well, as I said before, there is a list of uh, things that are correlates to diagnoses in the back of the DSM. And it's a very thorough list of life events that happen to people and affect them. Now, what I didn't say before, and perhaps I should be clear about this, you can't get paid on those correlate diagnoses. Okay, if it's an external event, we don't pay you for that. We only pay
Hmm.
you for the internal diagnosis you're giving. Okay, um, and so
Hmm.
there's a list that would be far helpful. It's in existence right now. If we simply were able to say, oh, this person has longitudinal what's the word I'm trying to say, has complex trauma that happened to them as a child because they were abused between the ages of 4 and 8. Okay, that's the diagnosis. All right, and so you're not going to say, oh, it's PTSD, it's depression, it's anxiety, it's ADHD. No, this is what happened to them. And so these are the kinds of problems we're working to move towards more secure attachments to help them regain their function.
Yeah. And maybe a system that was um, skewed toward people's well-being instead of the profiteering of
Yeah,
insurance companies or whatever other corporations, maybe
yeah,
that would help too, as a if we collectively valued that enough to like change systemically the way we approached the field. Good luck with that. But I mean, not to say it can't be done. I think it can be done with enough, perhaps, um, a strong enough collective will. Who knows?
exactly,
Um,
exactly. Yeah,
yeah,
I mean, there's a lot of stuff in the press about the mental health crisis, right? In my view, the the mental health crisis is precipitated by um, extremely fragmented ways of getting help that are inconsistent. That the pay varies widely between one insurance company and another, and what they'll pay for and another, and that many of them are controlled by people who majored in business, not psychology or social work.
yeah. And also, we haven't even touched on the fact that we're describing mental and physical health as if they're completely separate things, but obviously they're extremely connected, and we can have physical symptoms that derive from stress, and these things impact each other greatly. And we might have physical disease because of environmental conditions. We might have mental health issues as a function of other physical issues, whether they're environmental or who knows. I mean, the point being that it's a complex system of things, as you mentioned in the book. Even the human body is a complex system of things. And that passage on the microbiome,
Oh, yeah.
where you talk about all of the things that are living on us and in us that contribute to our functioning and existence as a human individual.
That's
All
right.
fascinating stuff, right? There's so much to us and to this, and we could probably go on endlessly. But for the sake of winding the conversation down,
Sure.
I'd like to first of all just thank you for your time and your thoughtfulness, and for your willingness to share with me about both your personal life and as well as professional philosophies and ideas. And I would ask you that at this stage, you talked about being in the Ericksonian life review stage,
Mhm.
and maybe this conversation has served in some respect to to contribute to that or facilitate that. But who at age 70 is the person you can't aspire to be at this point in your life, and who is the person you want to be now and moving forward, given your history and um and your life professionally and otherwise right now?
Wow, that's a good question. Different parts of me tend to let me know that they want to manifest themselves depending on the day or the hour of the day. Um, uh, there's a part of me that just wants to focus on bike riding. I'm an avid bike rider. So uh, there is also a part of me what the I'll give you a broad stroke of the book. The idea that our self-aware abstract thinking consciousness is both a blessing and a curse and gets in the way of our being able to function in the modern world in many ways, suggests that using some kind of meditation, and I don't want to say there's one kind to be used, some kind of yoga or meditative practice, I theorize, takes us back to a more pure state, a less cluttered state mentally, so that when we see animals react to something, without language, it's the language I give it, something is. Food is, cold is, danger is, okay? To get into a state that an animal might experience just temporarily, we can only experience it for a flash, right? That's what I theorize meditation is so good at. And it's a practice, the practice of being with what's you see behind your eyes, being with what you hear, being with what your tactile sense is, being with what your visceral sense is. Also, when thoughts are going to try and intrude, try and externalize your thoughts. I have this technique I use where I put thoughts into tubes coming out of my head. Oh, there's that thought. There's that thought, right? Some other clients I know have a thing where they put thoughts into bubbles and they can see them in bubbles. Giving yourself distance from thoughts, and also spending time with what is, and that tends to be sensory. That is a practice that I would like to somehow refine and share with people. Now, I know many people have done this, but I don't know that anyone's done it from the point of let's try and experience what an animal experiences without human thoughts. Let's put distance between our thoughts and what is right now. And so it's a long way of answering your question. I'd like to create some kind of meditation practice to share with people that has that as a reason behind it and as a goal within it.
I love your answer. I especially love the first part of it when you said that you had different parts that at different times of the day have different wants and aspirations. I think
Right.
that really resounds as true for me, certainly. And I think for most people probably listening can identify with that the person you want to be really depends on what hour of the day it is and what day it is.
That's right.
But at the same time, I liked that longer term vision of developing a meditation practice, both for yourself and that could be shared to help people disentangle from their thoughts and maybe not identify with them so strongly, because that can be the source of so much of our own self-perpetuated misery. And if we can, even for moments at a time, distance ourselves and realize that we are not our thoughts, and to just be, and as opposed to doing or thinking, to just be for a moment, that we can get a reprieve from that, and perhaps some longer term peace if we make a practice of it.
I listened to one of your other podcasts where the guy you were interviewing said he remembers when it first struck him that he became very anxious at a red light. When's this light going to change?
Oh, yeah.
And that he was able to step back and go, oh, there's that part of me talking to me. Oh yeah, there it is. Now, what would I like to do about it? That's it's not, the practice leads to that, but you can't say it's a direct line. It's like you do it and one day you're just with it. Oh yeah, there's that part of me. What do I want to do about that?
Yeah. Thank you again, Kent, for this wonderful conversation, for everything that you shared. And is there some place you would like to direct folks, listeners, and viewers who would like to learn more about you and your work?
Yes. So my book is called the Stop Breaking Down: The Secret to Avoiding Overwhelm and Crack-Up, and you can find it. There's a direct link to it on my website, kentw.net.
Wonderful. Thanks again, Kent.
Okay, thank you, Eric. I'm very grateful to have spent this time with you.